Welcome to the Progression Health Podcast. I'm here with Rich Blagrove. Rich, do you want to introduce yourself to the listeners?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much for the invitation to join you on the podcast this week, Ross. I really appreciate it and looking forward to the discussion. But yeah, my name's Rich Blagrove. I'm a senior lecturer in physiology at Loughborough University in the UK, and I've been working in academia, so university settings, for getting on for 18 years now. It's been quite a while. So yeah, I was based at a university in Birmingham for a couple of years before Loughborough. And prior to that, I was in London, working at a university called St Mary's, for around about 8 years. And yeah, I guess alongside all of the kind of research and teaching that I've done in university settings, I've also been a strength and conditioning coach for the last 20 years, and kind of unintentionally specialised a little bit in work with middle and long distance runners, partly because that was my own background as an athlete. But partly because that's always been my favourite sport and it's always been my main passion. So I've kind of naturally always gravitated towards wanting to work with runners and sort of built up a reputation in that area.
Very good. Yeah, I love the idea of like having the academic side of things, but also like the firsthand experience of your own running. So yeah, like what was your own running career like, and what was your kind of main event?
Yeah, I was a middle distance runner, so we're going quite a long way back now in terms of my competitive career. But I guess I was okay. Like I won a couple of regional titles. I was ranked in the top 10 in the UK for a couple of years as kind of like a sort of 16, 17 year old. And then, yeah, I trained quite hard at university, but probably a little bit too hard, because I kept picking up injuries. And I guess in many ways, like I was studying sport and exercise science at university at the time. And because of my natural love and sort of passion for sports science, I used to read a lot about injury prevention and kind of nutrition and supplements you could take and the way in which athletes should be managing their training and so on. And so I guess that kind of sparked my interest in strength and conditioning and sports science a little bit more broadly. And so when I left university, that's what I wanted to pursue, a career in sport and exercise science.
Yeah, that's like a pretty to be top 10 like at any age. It's not, there's so many people in the UK, like 50 odd million or whatever. So with overtraining, do you think that's like it's pretty just black and white? You overtrained and then or the intensity was too high and that's what caused the injuries, or
Yeah,
what do you think about that now after 18 years of academia?
yeah. I mean, for me personally, and sort of reflecting on it now, I think I was a little bit of a victim of just my own interest and passion in sports science, because I did used to sort of read and absorb anything based around sports science that I could lay my hands on, particularly around running training. And I used to write to a lot of different coaches. And back in those days, this is going to show my age a little bit now, but back in those days, it was kind of pen and paper. I used to write them a letter, tell them I was a young distance runner, and I had some lofty ambitions to become a professional athlete and so on. Could they offer me some training advice? And I did learn a lot through that process. But I think the problem with that is that you've got ideas from one coach over here, you've got suggestions from another coach here, another coach is telling you to do something else. And all the way through that process, I obviously had my own coach that was based at my athletics club and at university. And so you've got kind of all of these conflicting philosophies and ideas on different training approaches. And as a kind of young sports scientist and athlete, I was trying to sort of gel them all together and design my own training program. And yeah, as I say, I think looking back on it now, I did do a little bit too much too soon. I think particularly when it came to kind of easier recovery days, I was always running too fast, and I never really had proper time to kind of recover and regenerate. And yeah, as a consequence, it was mostly Achilles tendon injuries, that kept reoccurring. And yeah, by the time I got to kind of age 21, I decided that I probably needed to try another sport, so took up rowing.
Yeah, something with less impact on the joints for sure. So just with the recovery days, it's like they're kind of, to be honest, they're sort of boring when I think of a recovery day, because it's kind of just like I'm not achieving anything. But
Yeah,
yeah, why the emphasis on a recovery day when, you could just kind of do like a longer run that, would add more mileage to your total week, or almost set a PR on the track? You like, why are recovery days important?
Well, I mean, usually a recovery day is following some sort of much harder, um, high workload bout of exercise. So for a runner, that's usually going to be an interval training session. It might be a kind of tempo type workout where they may be running at about 10K half marathon type intensity, which is still pretty hard. Or it could be, like you say, quite a long extended run if you're preparing for a half marathon or a marathon. And so, I mean, those types of workouts, they are quite physically exhausting. They take a lot out of the body. Um, Key musculoskeletal structures are damaged and so need to sort of repair and recover. And the body needs some time to do that. And so one option is just to completely rest and to kind of go, well, I'm just going to take the next 2 or 3 days off training. And that probably is the best option for some young athletes or runners that are kind of new to the sport. But certainly for more well-trained athletes, and as they kind of build up tolerance to running more, what they can do after those hard sessions is just a small amount of kind of easier, low-intensity exercise. And so, you will often get runners going out for an easy run for a day or two after a hard workout, and they can still recover just as quickly and just as sufficiently. And what it allows over time is just the body to kind of build up more and more fitness as a result of the kind of volume of specific exercise that you're putting through the body, particularly in terms of sort of exercise economy and so on. And so you'll obviously see runners at an elite level doing really, really high volumes, but the majority of that volume is obviously at quite a low or easy intensity. So that this type of recovery day in between the hard sessions.
So when we're training, is it like a black and white thing where I feel like it's not based on what you're saying about recovery, but it's not a black and white thing where we're kind of either breaking down the body or it's recovering and building up? Because if we're doing a recovery day, but we're actually active, like, I guess in a physiological sense, like inside the body, just let's hypothetically say today I do a hard workout and then tomorrow I do an
Yeah.
easy run. Could you kind of just like explain in like simple terms just for the listeners what is sort of happening when you're doing that easy day after the hard day?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I guess we're mainly talking about trained individuals now that can kind of cope with like decent volumes of training. But essentially, whenever we do any sort of exercise, it's going to kind of lead to fatigue, but also we get kind of cellular signaling mechanisms right down at the molecular level that will activate whenever we put the body under any sort of physical stress. And so that's obviously a good thing because those cellular signaling mechanisms activate and they kind of produce this sort of cascade of different events and reactions down at a muscle level that drives different adaptations. So sort of build new capillaries, build new what we call mitochondria, which is where aerobic energy is created. Expand blood volume, expand some red blood cells within the vascular system, and so on. So all of these things can still be stimulated with sort of low to moderate type intensity exercise. So doing the exercise is beneficial, but obviously if we go too hard, particularly if it's after the day after a hard workout, it's just going to lead to kind of excessive fatigue and excessive damage within the body, which is much more difficult to recover. And so people just need to be careful with that balance between very, very stressful exercise, which causes a lot of kind of perturbation and signaling, versus the sort of lower intensity type of exercise, which still allows recovery, but still creates some of these adaptations, particularly if we accumulate them over time.
Got it. Yeah. And then in your own case, you're mentioning about like overtraining and then like listening to too many different like perspectives. That's something I definitely can resonate with myself because I have like a run coach
Yeah.
myself. And like just with social media, there's so much information out there. And I have your book right here, which is great strength conditioning for endurance running. And I found that very useful. And it wasn't conflicting at all because, my coach is running and the book is S&C. But yeah, like as in, what would you suggest to somebody who is going through the same situation as you were, or you're advising your younger self to be like maybe a better sort of like pupil or better, runner to
Yeah.
simplify the training?
Absolutely, it's a really, really good question, and yeah, I guess with young athletes in this day and age, it must be even more challenging than what I went through as a young athlete, because, as you say, you've got all of these influencers on social media. You've got just kind of these vast amounts of information that you can get your hands on just a click of a button. Plus, now we've got AI as well. So if you want to ask a question about something specific about training, you can get an essay back through AI. And so trying to navigate all of that must be really, really challenging for young athletes. I think probably the best advice that I can give, and I think if I was to go back and do my athletics career again, like I would stick to I'd stick to what my coach says a little bit more closely. So I would try to find somebody that knows what they're talking about, somebody that's got qualifications, like ideally has got a lot of experience of working with runners or athletes. And I would just kind of trust their process. Like there'll be that kind of outside set of eyes that can kind of see what's going on. They'll have a long-term plan in mind, and they'll use kind of progressive overload in a more kind of sensible way and individualize that around you as an athlete. And I think if young athletes can do that and place trust in their coach, they're not going to go too far wrong, rather than getting distracted by all of this other information that's out there.
So it's like simplifying the approach and following just one plan and building an understanding of one coach, as opposed to like a complete like scattered approach of like a bunch of half or quarter different plans all over the place. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly that. And I think kind of most coaches, as we're discussing here, like we've both been through this process. And so you kind of get to a point with the athletes that you're working with that you've got, I guess, a bit more clarity in terms of your own philosophy as a coach, in terms of what you know, sort of know works and what doesn't work, and where the scientific evidence kind of fits into all of that as well. And it's just for a combination of education and experience that we've been able to sort of reach this place, and then hopefully we can offer that wisdom and guidance to other athletes.
So, yeah. So speaking of philosophy, what is your own sort of philosophy based on like your own running career and having coached a lot of athletes and then your academic background? What's kind of like your approach to working with a client?
Yeah, I think questions around coaching philosophy are always really interesting, particularly if you hear from a lot of experienced coaches. Um, and yeah, I'm always kind of reflecting on my own, and I think as it's kind of my background as a scientist, but also just a reflection of my personality, that like I am quite sort of comprehensive and thorough and very sort of systematic with the way that I go about planning and programming for athletes. Probably sometimes a little bit too much. I think I'm also quite good at making sure that I use a very sort of human and or athlete centered approach with the way that I plan and program, and that's usually in collaboration with technical coaches and sometimes multidisciplinary teams. So like a physiologist or a physiotherapist that's also working with that athlete at the time. And what I've also tried to do more over the last sort of 5 years is just, and this really reflects the sort of way that I'm kind of coaching and consulting with athletes these days, is I try to just kind of empower and educate them as much as I possibly can, because, and it sounds kind of odd that you're sort of trying to coach your way out of a job, if you like, but you really want athletes to get to a point where they've kind of got enough knowledge and understanding of strength and conditioning that they can write themselves like a reasonable program. It might not be perfect and they might need a little bit of input, but they can do a pretty good job. And so moving forward, when they become more mature, more experienced, they're a little bit more self-sufficient. And they've got confidence that they can kind of manage their own training, maybe with their technical coach, rather than just relying on a specialist all the time. So I think that those are probably the three main areas that would sit within my own coaching philosophy.
Interesting. So like if a client goes to the point where they're able to coach themselves, what would be the difference versus, let's say they're just more dependent on the coach themselves? So like a dependent client versus like a very self-sufficient client, what would be the benefit of being more self-sufficient?
Um, well, partly they save money. So yeah, we're obviously trying to run businesses and sort of make money as consultants or whatever for ourselves. So that is obviously still important. Um, but yeah, I think for the athlete, like if they're really heavily reliant on sort of you as a practitioner, and every time they reach the end of the block, they're kind of waiting on their new program, or they don't really know what direction to go next, then they are kind of very reliant and dependent on you as an individual. Whereas if they can kind of make small decisions themselves, or there's maybe something they're unsure about, they can still come back to you. But in terms of just the main components of a program, they might understand what works best for them already. And I think that's often what I see with particularly very experienced athletes that I've been working with for maybe 5, 10 years, or have at least input into their program. They just kind of figure out what works best for them. And if they've got a history of a certain type of injury, but they can kind of manage it and stay on top of it, they're usually like, well, this combination of exercises, Rich, seems to help manage this type of injury. And so I don't think it's a good idea to change the program. And so they'll kind of move forward by themselves, sort of knowing what works best for them, just for a process of sort of iteration and figuring it out.
Yeah, so it's more like a collaborative approach where it's like you kind of transition to a consultant role.
Yes, exactly that. Yeah. No, I guess a collaborative approach is probably the best way to describe it. Whereas I guess with the much younger athletes, or those that haven't stepped foot in a weights room before, you are going to need to be much more directive with what they do, just because they are complete novices in that environment. So they're going to need some basic instruction.
Absolutely, yeah. And something that I notice with people who have a background in strength training but not running, because a lot of people are getting into running now. I feel like it's just
Yeah,
through a boom completely. Like across the world is they'll try and do the same gym workouts they were doing and just adding running into it. So what are kind of like some common mistakes that you see people making in their strength and conditioning work that they can avoid and just make it more sustainable long term to do both the S&C and the running?
yeah. I think one of the main mistakes, you almost kind of hit upon it there, and we were kind of alluding to it, that I think runners sometimes have this sort of fear around strength training and lifting weights in particular, that it is really fatiguing. It's going to make them really tired and really sore, and it's going to impact their running training. But I usually try to encourage them to reframe it a little bit, in that it's an important part of their program, but it is kind of just training. It doesn't have to be this really kind of exhaustive, tiring workout where you get out of bed the next morning and you can barely walk down the stairs, but you've still got to go for a run. That if they get the program right, they're putting enough overload through their muscles and their neuromuscular system, but it's not necessarily impacting their running aggressively, and particularly, adversely affecting running on a sort of day-to-day basis. So I think that's probably one of the sort of misconceptions, that it's this kind of really scary thing that is going to leave people like mega stiff the next day. I think something else which is a little bit of a common misconception is that the exercises that you need to select as a runner sort of need to look like running, like it needs to kind of mimic the biomechanics or the kinematics of a running stride. And it's not really the purpose of strength training. Like the reason that you would engage with strength training is to try to overload the neuromuscular system in the most sort of optimal and effective way. So therefore you need to pick the kind of exercises and the tools in a weights room environment that kind of allow you to do that. And so a lot of the time those skills and the exercises that you select might look nothing like running, but it doesn't necessarily matter, because it's the best sort of stimulus or stress to drive adaptations in the neuromuscular system. And so you'll still get kind of transfer and benefit to the action of running and some of the running physiology, and we know that quite well through the research. So I think if people want to mimic the running stride, you're probably better to go out for a run. If you want to get stronger and do strength training, like pick the exercises that will allow you to get stronger.
Yeah, get stronger in the gym and get better at running when you're out running.
Yes,
Keep it simple. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So something that, personally comes up for me with being in the gym is, I like to train to feel stronger, to build a little bit of muscle and, for aesthetics as well. And I feel like that kind of runs counter to being a good runner. I hear like, oh, such and such needs to learn to lose a certain amount of muscle because having muscle as a runner is bad and you just need to be as light as possible. So how do you kind of manage that where, we're in the gym and you can build muscle very easily in the gym if you train effectively,
Yeah.
but that your power to weight ratio can be kind of like thrown off, or you just don't see a whole lot of elite runners training to build a whole lot of muscle. How do you kind of reconcile that difference?
Yes, it's certainly two slightly different outcomes. I mean, what we know fairly well from the research and the literature, and this is across about 30 different studies that have investigated the use of strength training with runners, is that at least over a period of several months, if runners engaged with a couple of strength training sessions a week, it's highly unlikely that they're going to put on any sort of significant amount of muscle mass, which is going to result in an increase in body mass and therefore be disadvantageous to their performance. And that's been shown pretty consistently across the literature. There's a few different potential reasons for that, but I think probably the primary one is that the volume of strength training that you need to do in order to put on a meaningful amount of muscle mass, like it is kind of moderate to high, even for somebody that's fairly new to strength training. The type of volume that's being used in these studies that I mentioned, like it's not particularly high. So it's something between about 6 and 12 sets of work for lower limb muscles, or doing movement patterns which stress the lower limb within each individual session. And so I think when like a bodybuilder goes to the gym, or somebody that's going with the sole purpose to develop muscle mass and get this sort of hypertrophy type response, like they'll quite often do 15, 20, maybe 25 sets on a particular muscle group within a session. And yeah, the studies that have been done in runners, they just don't get anywhere near that. I think if they did get closer to that, like you might well see some hypertrophy occurring. But yeah, runners don't need to kind of fear that they're going to put on muscle mass, just because it doesn't seem to happen, at least over a period of a few months. I think if you have got sort of fitness enthusiasts and I don't know, maybe people that are training for things like high rocks, or yeah, maybe just aesthetics, then potentially putting a little bit more volume through the muscle or training a little bit more frequently does make a lot of sense. Like you probably make the program a bit more upper body biased, for example, or have a day where you concentrate a bit more on muscles within the upper body. But obviously, it's somebody that's just running and their sole purpose is to perform and to compete in running. They don't necessarily need to do that. So it's kind of two slightly different outcomes, I guess.
Yeah, you have to really intentionally train to build muscle for that to
Yes, yeah,
happen. And if you're not doing that, it's like how is it going to happen really? So there's actually no genuine concern that a runner is going to put on too much muscle. Is that fair to say?
based on the literature and the evidence we've got at the moment, yeah, there doesn't seem to be much concern at all. I think a bit more anecdotally with the runners that I've worked with over really long periods of time, so sort of years. Again, like we don't really notice any massive change in body mass. And if there is changes, it's usually because they've gone from being a 16-year-old to an 18-year-old to they're just sort of naturally maturing. And so the changes, yeah, do tend to be quite small. So yeah, runners don't need to worry or stress about that.
Brilliant to hear, and I'm sure a lot of other people. So good to clear that one up. And
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
I think clearing things up and kind of like simplifying S&C is what your book did. And something that I
Thanks.
took away from it was like it's not that complicated to train as a runner in the gym. It's actually, if anything, it's a lot simpler than people initially think, or I initially thought. I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel. Strength training, and
Yeah.
also just like we're just discussing, it's not, we don't have to do a crazy amount of volume to get a benefit for the running. And then secondarily as well, it's just like all of the kind of the skipping movements, the hurdle movements, that was something especially new to me, not being a runner growing up. So yeah, what did you learn most writing the book yourself, and what were kind of some surprises you picked up from just putting it together?
Yeah, no, thanks for asking me that question. It's not a question that anybody's asked me before. I don't think. But yeah, I think when you're putting together a quite a comprehensive book like that, you've kind of got a clear idea of what you want to get out of it and what you want the content to be. But I think as I was kind of working my way through each chapter, and I was sort of like engrossed in writing the content of each chapter, it does kind of clarify. I'm not sure if philosophy is the right word, but it clarifies your own sort of way of thinking about exercises to some extent. Um, and I think a little bit more fundamentally, even like you sort of, yeah, kind of reminds you of some basics around biomechanics and kinesiology to some extent, that you maybe got two very, very similar exercises, um, but that are stressing a particular muscle or joint in slightly different ways. And when you kind of break down the mechanics of it, and you maybe just explore the literature a little bit, and you're like, oh, okay, I've learned something new about what muscle that particular exercise is targeting. And so yeah, I think just getting sort of clarity of thought and clarity around the approach that I use in order to program for athletes was probably the biggest thing that I took away from it, and hopefully put across those messages as clearly as possible within the book.
Yeah, it did definitely give me a lot of clarity, and it's definitely something I want to reread as well, because it's just kind of like reminding me of the fundamentals and to keep things simple. And then, I'm primarily like a half marathon and marathon runner, and
Mm.
the book touched us a lot on like kind of track, like skipping and the hurdle work, and it's
Yeah.
something that's relatively new to me. So can you just like go into that a little bit and explain about like why it's important and physiologically what's happening in the body when you're doing that, and then who is it especially useful for?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what you're describing there is different forms of plyometric exercise, and that's something that we haven't mentioned yet. Everything we've spoken about so far is largely been around sort of heavy resistance training. And so yeah, plyometric training is probably the kind of most potent strength and conditioning stimulus that a runner can use to improve their performance. Partly because the kind of biomechanics of plyometric skills, so things like skips and jumps and hopping and bounding, like it is very, very similar to the running stride. But essentially, what you're doing on those exercises is when a runner lands from each of those during each of those skills, they're landing with a little bit more force than the running stride. And what comes with more force is also a greater amount of energy or potential energy that they can use. And so essentially what you're trying to do on those exercises is manage and produce a little bit more force through a really similar skill to running. And then with the energy, you're trying to get the tendons, so particularly the Achilles tendon, to store that energy as elastic energy, and then reuse it in order to propel the runner into the next stride. And so we know through the research that plyometric training is a really good stimulus for improving the storage and return of that elastic energy from the Achilles tendon. And because you use that as part of the running stride, that's the main reason that it improves things like running economy and then ultimately running speed and performance. So it's essentially just making the tendons and the muscles a little bit more efficient and getting them to do their job a little bit better.
So if you had a client who was new to plyometrics and skipping, what would be kind of, I don't want to oversimplify and say what's the one exercise, but what is like maybe
Yeah,
some of the
sure.
basic ones that could provide the most benefit? And let's just say also, a lot of people are tight on time. So it's like, is there kind of maybe like a certain way they could do it, like before or after or just after a workout, to get the most stimulus, like maybe on a track session or on a recovery day? Is there a certain protocol you'd recommend initially?
Yeah, absolutely. As I was kind of alluding to before, what we have with plyometric training is is the generation of higher forces. So when the leg and the foot lands on the ground, you want to initially encourage the runners to manage those forces effectively. So the best start point for any sort of plyometric exercise is just purely working on the landing phase. So we do really simple things with runners and athletes, like just getting them to jump on the spot and then land with good control. So land somewhere around the middle part of their foot. Make sure that their knees are aligned to their ankles and their hips. Make sure they've got good posture, so their spine's like relatively neutral and their chest's up. And if they can do that from a sort of maximal jump, then they've developed quite good control on two legs. And then you can progress to one leg. So they jump up and land on one leg. You can do a hop and stick where they transition forward by about a meter to a meter and a half. And all of the time, you're just kind of working on the kind of control that they're experiencing on landing. So trying to manage those forces. And then we can progress that to then rebounding. So actually getting the benefit from plyometrics. And so again, using the simple example of jumping on the spot, instead of just landing, when the athlete lands, we can get them to rebound off the surface very, very quickly. So to try and spend a short time in contact with the ground. Then we can get them to do it over a hurdle, for example, or we can get them to go off a box and onto another box. And then all of a sudden you've got hurdle jumps and you've got drop jumps and box jumps. And then it's the same concept with hopping as well. So we go just from a hop and stick, and so sticking the landing, to, okay, now bounce into a second hop. And so they do 2 hops in a row, and then 3, and then 4, and so on. And then gradually lengthen the distance out until they're sort of hopping continuously. And so for some athletes that are relatively strong and can manage forces quite well, that kind of progression can be fairly quick. Like you might get them there within the space of a few weeks. For younger athletes, or those that haven't done any sort of strength and conditioning before, it might take years to get to that point. And so they're just kind of working on quite low intensity skills for months and months, and maybe their teenage years in the case of a young athlete. And then gradually over time, they start building up the volume and then the intensity of those exercises. So yeah, hopefully that kind of gives you quite a comprehensive answer to how we might progress plyometrics. But it is a case of, working on the skill initially and then just gradually building up the intensity.
Yeah, initially it was a bit vague, and now I'm like almost excited to like go out and try it myself, because there's progression there, and I can almost like really intuit how difficult it would be by the end of, stringing multiple reps and sets together. And I'm interested in, so if someone's doing, let's just say hypothetically 20 weeks of plyometrics, they progress from week 1 to week 20, what would they notice in their actual race? So like in a half marathon and a marathon, what effect would it have on their actual performance, like that they could feel in their running?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, that, because the sensation that both I've experienced and we hear a lot from runners and even participants in our research studies is that at the end of an intervention, whether it's heavy resistance training or plyometrics, they're kind of like, I just sort of feel really strong, particularly in the latter stages of hard training sessions or races. And it's essentially what they kind of experience is this sort of second wind phenomenon, where they're kind of moving along, and they're moving along at a pace that they kind of expect to be able to sustain for the race or the time trial effort. But as they get further into the event and sort of beyond halfway, they just kind of feel really good, and they feel like they're not quite close to their max, and so they can increase the pace as it gets closer and closer to the end, and so they end up kind of negative splitting and speeding up in the latter part of the race. A little bit more scientifically, the reason that we think that happens is because of an improvement in running economy, which I did kind of allude to before. But running economy is a main aerobic determinant of long distance running performance, and is essentially how much energy or oxygen that a runner's using at a submaximal intensity. And so if we were to measure how much oxygen or energy that you were using at your marathon speed, we could quantify essentially what your running economy is. And the lower the value is, the better. So somebody's more economical if they're using less energy or oxygen to run at a given speed. And so what we know about running economy is that it's definitely influenced by some kind of physiological factors within the body, but also the runner's biomechanics, also shoe technology. so the type of shoes that we've got on our feet. But then really importantly for the strength and conditioning coach, we know that it's heavily underpinned by some neuromuscular factors. And neuromuscular factors can be improved via strength training. And so the mechanism by which plyometrics and heavy resistance training works is we get this improvement in the neuromuscular system. We get changes in the way that muscle fibers and fascicles are kind of behaving and the way in which they're using energy. And so therefore that improves running economy and probably performance. So that kind of second wind phenomenon, or just the feeling of being quite strong towards the end of a race, is probably because they've saved a lot of energy and oxygen during the early parts of a race. They don't kind of set off faster necessarily. They set off at a speed that they can manage and sort of speed up as the event progresses. And it's kind of what we've seen in both research and in practice, and obviously works quite well.
So a typical kind of marathon build is roughly 16 weeks, give or take, we'll say. So, and if you disagree, let me know. So what would you recommend as just like a general kind of safe amount of plyometrics per week that someone could see a benefit from across the 16 weeks?
Yeah, so the way that we would tend to structure it is, for a runner that has never done plyometrics before, I guess kind of that initial sort of weeks 1 to 4 would be going through the process that I described before. So initially working on kind of motor control, and an ability to attenuate these forces, and just working on the skills of these new plyometric movements that we're trying to teach. And we generally do that with about 30 to 60 foot contacts per session. So across, and that's by foot contacts, I mean kind of repetitions within an exercise. And so you might break that up across, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 different exercises per session, and do that 2 to 3 times. Do that 2 to 3 times per week. We would then progress by bringing in like sort of what I'd call like proper plyometrics, where they're actually rebounding off the ground, as I was describing before. So still relatively low intensity, but just making sure that they're spending as short a time in contact with the ground as possible, and just sort of being really reactive off the surface. And then you start to build a little bit more volume into that type of work as well. And you might get up to sort of 60, 70, maybe even 80 foot contacts per session. And then I'll then probably go through a bit of a phase where we're trying to raise the intensity a little bit. And so go off slightly bigger boxes, or maybe go over slightly higher hurdles, or try and extend the distance that we're hopping or bounding on exercises, but try and leave the number of foot contacts that we're doing the same through that period. And then I think as the volume really ramps up in a marathon preparation, particularly the long run, you might want to kind of maintain on that sort of level, maybe for the next 4 weeks, just so you're not sort of risking any kind of injury or overtraining. And then in the final sort of 3 or 4 weeks, it's probably a good idea to start tapering that type of work down, and so start to reduce the volume towards about 50% of what the runner has been doing, but try to keep the intensity the same. And so the runner stays within their sort of normal routine of, I'm doing this 2 to 3 times a week, but they've just reduced down the volume of work that they're doing to kind of accommodate the running and make them a little bit more fresh.
Yeah, like a sort of traditional deload as such.
Yes,
or
exactly.
tapering. Yeah. So,
yeah,
my watch tells me predictions for times and, what it thinks I can do and VO2 max stuff, but it doesn't do running economy. How would a runner measure their running economy? Or is there a way to do
that? Sadly, no, there is. the only valid way to do it really is in a laboratory where you can collect expired gas samples, and you can actually then quantify the amount of oxygen that's obviously in the atmosphere and the amount that the runner's breathing out, and so therefore you get an oxygen consumption, and you can also calculate energy consumption from that as well. So that's the only really valid way of doing it. There's been quite a lot of talk in the last sort of 5 to 10 years around these kind of power meters that are coming out, and I think it's generally thought that those are kind of measuring some aspect of metabolic power, if you like, rather than kind of mechanical power output. And so they're given a gauge or an indirect reflection of essentially somebody's running economy, like from a metabolic point of view, like how much energy that they're using when they're running uphill, downhill on the flat at different speeds. And so I think there's probably sort of more research or work to be done to make sure that those devices are valid. But I think the reading that it's giving is reflective of a runner's economy, as I say, rather than their mechanical power output.
Yeah, I use a power meter myself, and I find it
Yeah.
very useful as an extra data point. So I have, heart rate, pace, and then the power. So it's kind of like a triangulation of the three.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
just in terms of kind of like, people's physiques and bodies and stuff like that, where does a person's weight and their body come into kind of like their efficiency and maybe kind of like how well they could be, at their very best? Like, does physique come into it at a certain point, or is it like it's not really that relevant? What's your kind of take on that?
Yeah, it does. And I guess we've got to be a little bit careful with this area of sort of body composition and physique with runners, just because we know that there's a really high prevalence of disordered eating and a syndrome known as relative energy deficiency in sport. There's a high percentage, particularly at the well-trained and elite level, that kind of borderline this syndrome, which is a sort of a clinical illness essentially. And so, yeah, it's always, as a coach, you've always got to be very, very careful around sort of saying, well, runners need to be as light as possible, or you need to try and lose loads of body fat or even muscle mass in order to try to optimize their performance. And what we tend to see, and with the runners that I've worked with over long periods of time, like if they're healthy, so what I mean by that is their energy intake is kind of roughly matching their energy expenditure, and they're in kind of good energy availability. They've not had too many illnesses and injuries. They tend to reach a weight which is probably about right for them, but it's completely individual. And so you'll see some very elite distance runners that are incredibly kind of ectomorphic, like they're just very, very lean, very, very skinny, but they're actually very, very healthy. And it's just genetically that's kind of how they're kind of predisposed to look. And equally, I've worked with runners where I think some people would sort of look at them and go, well, they're not the sort of stereotypical runner, but they're incredibly fast and they're operating at a really high elite level. But they're sort of within their kind of body shape and size, or what's kind of optimal for them, and they've sort of found that optimal. And so I'd definitely discourage people from looking at another runner or looking at a general trend and kind of saying, well, I need to be a little bit lighter and a bit skinnier because that person over there is the same sort of height as me, but they're a little bit lighter. It's probably just the fact that, like again, genetically, they're predisposed to be a slightly different body size, and to stay healthy and to optimize their performance, like they will kind of look different and they'll be a slightly different shape. And so everybody kind of falls into their own sort of physique as long as they're remaining healthy.
So would it be fair to say that over time, through running, through strength training, you'll kind of become your ideal individual physique, as opposed to like having this predetermined physique that
Yeah.
you see like an elite runner run at, and it's like, oh, I have to get there. I have to fit myself to there, as opposed to just letting your body sort of change naturally over time. Is that a more realistic approach?
Exactly that. Yeah, you've probably summarized it better than what I said there. Yeah, and I think even at an elite level, like if we were to look down the start line in like an Olympic final or a world championship race, you would kind of see that everybody's slightly different body shapes and sizes, and they don't all sort of fit exactly the same mold. And so, yeah, I think through like good systematic training, which is individualized, and a healthy diet and sort of sound nutrition, people sort of drift to their own optimal shape and size, and that's appropriate for them. And so it's important, yeah, not to start looking at how everybody else looks and try to fit their shape.
Yeah, and I think something as well is like people might see, the quote unquote optimal physique, but then how they feel when they're there compared to where they
exactly.
are, or what it would take to get there. It's like it just would not feel right, or it wouldn't even be worth it. It would just be like too much of a sacrifice, and they'd be like deprived of. They could even have the condition, the red S or red syndrome
Yes.
as well. Yeah,
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's kind of a sort of short to medium term fix, I think, a lot of the time. That I think what you've just described happens a lot, which is why there's such a high prevalence of disordered eating and this red S syndrome. But in my experience, yeah, like a runner might have a one-off successful season because they've lost 3, 4, 5 kilograms in weight. Um, and they look and feel unhealthy, and they sort of probably know they're unhealthy. Like with a female, they might have lost their menstrual cycle, for example, but it's quite short lived. Like it's just not sustainable over a long period of time. And so they'll maybe go into the next winter training and they'll break down with an injury and maybe a stress fracture, worst case scenario, or their performance will start to suffer in terms of sort of overtraining and illness. And then, yeah, you sort of see them the next season and they're not performing as well, or they're just not performing at all because they're injured. And so, yeah, you sort of see these particularly quite young athletes sort of drift in and out of the sport quite quickly. And because, yeah, they've just tried to take some sort of shortcut to success, which is based around a quick reduction in body weight.
yeah, that's a great point. So, like, if somebody is trying to stay in the sport long term, they really enjoy it. They don't want to kind of overdo it, overtrain. You know, what would be a sign that someone is close to like overdoing it, close to injury? Because there's a lot to manage. There's the running and the strength training. So maybe you could take it separately in terms of in the gym or in the track. But what would you recommend if someone is potentially getting too close to that point of injury?
Yeah, I think with injuries, particularly those runners that are training very hard and they're running once or twice every day of the week. Um, like in my experience, most are carrying niggles like all the time. Like they wake up in the morning and it's sort of like, okay, well, what hurts? Like as long as those niggles and those little aches and pains like disappear relatively quickly, and so with a short warm up, like they're running normally and they're running pain free, then that's obviously kind of fine. So these aches and pains, they tend to subside either with warm ups or within sort of 24 to 48 hours. The concern obviously comes when any sort of pain that an athlete's experiencing doesn't go away when they start running. It either gets worse or it remains there. And then they maybe complete a session or a run, and it's still there the next day and then the next after that. So it's kind of lingering there in the background. And then you'd probably end up defining it as an injury, even though they're trying to run through it. And so, yeah, I think to answer your question, it's sort of any kind of discomfort and low level pain, which is quite short lived, is probably normal for most runners. Anything which starts to affect biomechanics and the actual running itself is more of a cause for concern. And I think then with overtraining and yeah, things like red S and just more broadly sort of illness with runners, I think there's always an expectation that a coach would have in terms of like the paces or the heart rates that runners should be hitting. And I think if a runner's quite tired, and we'd often term that sort of like overreached, that they've maybe just had a hard week of training, as long as the runner's still hitting the sort of lower end of some of those paces, for example, it's probably okay. It's sort of like expected. So you've had a hard week's training. We know you're heavily fatigued, but you've got more of a recovery week coming up, or we're going to go into a tapering period. And so therefore you'll bounce back from that and get a kind of super compensation. I think the concern comes when you have a succession of different, particularly interval training sessions or runs where the pace is way down, or the athlete's perceived exertion is really high, or their heart rate's really high. And it's like, well, we've had several runs like this now, and it's kind of indicating things aren't quite right, like these basic physiological metrics. So we probably need to back off now rather than in a couple of weeks' time, as we'd planned. And there's obviously nothing wrong with doing that. It's just kind of communicating with the coach and reading these warning signs. And that there are other things as well, particularly with eating behaviors. So if athletes have kind of got this sort of obsession with food and snacking and the types of food that they're eating after training, if they've got mood disturbances, if visually you're seeing that they've lost weight quite quickly, these are all sort of big warning signs that they might be developing the red S syndrome, as we've mentioned. And so it's definitely things that coaches should be keeping an eye on. And I guess the main thing is just open communication with the athletes.
Yeah, and back to your point about having a coach and how that connection is just so important to be able to keep it open with the communication, and you can just kind of almost look after the person as well as the athlete. But
Yeah.
going back to the injuries and how strength training fits in, have you seen clients, or in your own experience, or just other athletes that you've heard of, where they actually haven't got injured at all? Because I just feel as though having an injury as a runner, it's almost like, oh yeah, of course you got injured, but there's got to be cases where someone hasn't got injured. So do you think there's a certain approach, or there's certain people that don't get an actual injury with running?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of runners around that either haven't been injured or go through very long spells of training without picking up any niggles or injuries. And I mean, at the moment with my own training, like touch wood, I've I've been through a pretty decent spell of training without too many problems and interruptions. So that's obviously a really good thing. I think the main thing to get that sort of consistency, we talk about like these sort of threats to consistency, and yeah, when we're talking about those, I mean we've spoken about a lot of them on the podcast already. It's largely around load management and making sure that you're not progressing too quickly, um, or going a bit too fast on easy runs, for example. You're allowing enough kind of recovery and restoration between the individual hard sessions, um, and yeah, sort of replicating the same type of training program week in week out is probably better than trying to get a 5% improvement for like 10 weeks and then picking up some sort of niggle or injury. Like the consistency will always trump the sort of perfect progressive overloads pattern, if you like. So taking things slow, being really, really patient with training, and just nudging it forward when the time is kind of right and when it's appropriate. I think the other kind of key characteristic with those that don't seem to get injured is that they're generally very, very good at recovering. So what I mean by that is they're getting sort of 8 to 9 hours of sleep per night, which we know is the kind of cornerstone of high quality recovery. They've generally got very good eating behaviors, and they've got good energy availability, so they're getting in enough energy to fuel their training and their performance. And they're also very, very good at modifying their training based on any kind of lifestyle stress that's happening. So particularly with a lot of students that we work with at the university, they'll go through periods like at the moment actually, where they're doing a lot of exams. So in a period of 10 days, they've got maybe like 5 exams. And so they're staying up a little bit later to revise. They're having to get up early and go to an exam for 2 or 3 hours. And it's kind of this sort of stress that actually causes perturbations to hormones and immune system and so on. And so actually you sort of need to back off a little bit on the amount of physical training that you're doing. And it's the same with other silly things, like if people go through sort of breakups in a relationship, or they have a bereavement in their family, or just any kind of general stress and anxiety that's happening within their lives, will cause sort of physiological perturbation that impacts recovery processes. And so, again, if a coach is aware of those sorts of things, they can be making tweaks and changes to the athlete's training program, which might mean a bit of a dip in volume or intensity one week, but it just allows the consistency of training to keep going for months and years rather than just short periods of time.
Yeah, being flexible, when life shows up and happens, and
Yeah.
yeah, knowing yourself and be able to eat a little bit more or less depending on how you're feeling, and modifying your training. So just across a marathon build with strength training, do you recommend that somebody already has like almost like a foundational training block in place and then they commence marathon training, or can they start the gym and S&C work in, week one of a marathon block?
Yeah, I guess it sort of depends on the individual, really. I mean, I think in an ideal world, you'd have all runners kind of commencing strength and conditioning from the start of their running career when they're quite young athletes. Um, but I sometimes get contacted by runners, and they'll be kind of like mid-season, so halfway through an outdoor track season in kind of like June, July, and they're like, "Oh, I want to start doing strength training for the first time." And I'm like, "Well, aren't you in the middle of your track season? You've done some races, you've got some big races coming up." Um, but they just kind of see it as important, so they want to sort of get started with their training. So it's similar in this scenario, that I think there's probably a perfect time that a runner could start, but they're sort of never too late. That if they start halfway through a marathon block, that's probably better than doing nothing. But it might have been better to start on week zero, in an ideal world. So yeah, I think usually, and to maybe answer your question a little bit more specifically, like what I try to do with the strength and conditioning is it almost kind of like preempt what's about to happen in the running training. So we try to develop the sort of physical capacities and particularly strengthen some key musculoskeletal structures that are going to be stressed in the next block of the running training, if that makes sense. And so I'll sometimes have runners that go on training camps, for example, and the training camp throws up a bunch of different physical stresses that they don't have in their home environment, in the UK. And so we'll kind of gear the strength and conditioning around trying to prepare them for their training camp so they don't get injured while they go away. And I guess the more simple example is with like a middle distance runner, they'll go through usually a block pre-season, which is a bit more sprint focused, or they start introducing high intensity sprinting work. And so in the couple of months before that, I'll be doing a lot of work on the hamstrings, for example, just to prep them for the early sprint work. So we're not necessarily prepping them for the track races. It's just kind of like training to get them ready for the training. And so yeah, you're always kind of thinking ahead of, well, what's coming up in the next 6 weeks. So it's the same with that kind of, yeah, that 20-week marathon preparation block, that ideally the strength and conditioning would be heavily loaded to the front, because at some point the runner's going to hit 24 miles in a long run and they're not going to be able to do strength and conditioning the next day because they're so tired. And so you want to kind of get it out the way early on and get them prepared for that. And so you can therefore just be maintaining later in the cycle.
Yeah, almost like a pre-season or off-season phase of
Yeah.
loading up on the S&C. Yeah, brilliant. So just a few quick fire questions, Rich, to wrap up on. So
Yeah, sure.
what is, from what you've seen, the most underrated S&C exercise for runners?
An area that we've not really spoken too much about, is the calf muscles. And so, I mean, yeah, my general approach to strength training for runners is to use kind of multi-joint compound type movements, and to try to hit all of those across a training week if we can. But what we know fairly well from the scientific literature is the biggest energy consumer in the body whenever we're running at speeds of up to sort of 4 minutes a mile, so 24 kilometers an hour, is the soleus muscle. So the soleus muscle is the big muscle that's deep within our calf, and it's a major kind of energy drain, if you like it consumes huge amounts of energy, and consumes more energy as the running speed increases up to that 4 minutes per mile. And so, yeah, the kind of implication for strength and conditioning is that muscle needs to be strong, and we need to try to, I guess, make it as efficient as possible. And so it's a long way of answering it, but something like a heavily loaded calf raise or an isometric kind of calf press on a machine is absolutely imperative for every single runner.
Great. Yeah, that's very easy to understand. So next, the most overrated, the opposite side of things, most overrated S&C exercise for runners.
Yeah, so tricky one that, isn't it? You could potentially upset a lot of people here. Um, it might sound slightly controversial, but I think if particularly a marathon runner didn't do any upper body work at all, I do sometimes wonder if it would matter. um, because it's the upper body's used to kind of like counteract some of the rotations that are going on, but compared to sprinting, where the forces that are being produced in the lower limb are really high. They're not particularly high when we're just trying to sustain sort of marathon running intensity. And so you'll look at a lot of elite marathon runners, they don't really move their upper body very much. They try to keep it very relaxed. And they're obviously all very skinny. They've barely got any muscle mass at all. And I do sometimes wonder, I'm like, if we didn't do any upper body work, would it really matter that much? And I don't really know what the answer is. But yeah, like I think if a runner was short of time and I had to strip the program down, I'd maybe be like, well, don't worry about doing any upper body work.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, if you're periodizing your training across like a year or like a longer term approach, then for the 16-week build, take out the upper body and then, after or before put it back in. So
Yes, yeah, exactly. And as you'll know really well, like there's a lot of lower limb exercises, particularly things like the deadlift, that use the upper body quite a lot. Like if you're doing the exercise properly, you're engaging a huge amount of upper body musculature, so you kind of get an indirect benefit from those exercises.
that's a great point. Yeah. So the next one then is, what would be like a test for someone to see how durable they are in the scenario where they're like entering a 16-week block, or they're just kind of like, is my body capable of handling more load, like running volume load or maybe
Yeah,
weight load?
yeah. I think it might be a bit of a cop out answer this, but um, it's not necessarily a test, but like really their injury history. I think if the biggest risk factor for a future injury is previous injury, unfortunately. And so if a runner has had a lot of problems in the past, it's like, yeah, I had IT band syndrome last year, I had a stress fracture, I've got Achilles tendon issues now. But yeah, I think I can get through this block. Like the likelihood they're going to break down with a problem is very high. Um, I think from a more sort of pure S&C perspective, like we'll sometimes use what we call these sort of muscular capacity tests. And so we do sort of like single leg calf raises to exhaustion. We'll do like a single leg bridge to exhaustion. We'll do like side holds and a prone hold to look at capacity around the trunk. Um, and yeah, there's some evidence that those can predict injury. So if you can't do very many calf raises and you've not got great capacity around calf and Achilles, the likelihood you're going to get a sort of foot ankle type problem might be quite high. So it's maybe something to address. So again, sorry for the long-winded answer, but probably injury history is the best test.
No, it makes total sense. I appreciate the detail. So then another question is, one metric you look at with your runners outside of just, pace in terms of like their performance and if they're progressing over a build.
Yeah, again, it sounds really basic, but I would go with like a perceived exertion. Um, I think yeah, the reason perceived exertion is so good is obviously it kind of combines all of the physiological systems of the body. Um, and yeah, it's like the runner then tells you how they're feeling based upon all of those kind of inputs that they're getting from the different physiological systems. And so as we've kind of mentioned in the discussion earlier on, if a runner's starting to feel like overly fatigued and starting to get a little bit overtrained, then perceived exertion will start to become really high, for the same pace as you mentioned, on easy runs, on sort of controlled tempo type efforts. And so the coach should be like, well, a month ago you weren't feeling like this, and you maybe been feeling like this for a few days now. And equally straight after we finish runs, if runners can kind of write down how hard they found that session, then tracking that over time is a really good gauge of yeah, how much workload they've been doing, as well as how much fatigue they're experiencing as well.
Yeah, you can have a really instant feedback loop of did that session, it was, 6 out of 10, and trace that over time. That's very useful.
Yes, exactly that. Yeah.
And then the last one is almost a question aimed at the two of us, but the best advice for runners in their 30s and 40s, you want to keep improving. It's kind of like, how do we age well as we run?
Yeah, definitely. And again, it really comes down to this notion of just being consistent. And I think people, yeah, it's a really sort of fashionable word at the moment. You hear athletes saying it when in TV interviews, you see it on social media all the time. But I think the thing that annoys me a bit is it's like most people that are motivated to run or they're motivated to run a marathon, like they'll happily be consistent because they're motivated. Like you tell them to do any sort of training session and they'll do it because they trust you as the coach. And so what people really mean when they say, oh, I've had good consistency is that they've actually avoided threats to consistency. Does that make sense? So they haven't been injured, ill, or overtrained because they've been sensible with a whole bunch of stuff that relates to their training and their lifestyle. And so we mentioned some of these things. So in order to be consistent, an athlete needs to avoid like sudden and big jumps in their training loads. They need high quality recovery, which is primarily sleep. They need good nutrition and good energy intake. And I mean, those three things are the sort of big rocks of kind of recovery and injury prevention, and will allow runners to be consistent long term. And then there's obviously lots of other stuff. So we know that strength and conditioning will likely reduce risk of runners getting injured. Yeah, making sure that the runners back off during periods of kind of high stress is another thing. And then there's all these kind of like micro things, like there's bits of evidence around like ice baths and compression garments and some supplements, foam rolling as another example. And so we're not necessarily ruling those things out, but they're quite sort of minor things or kind of micro strategies in the grand scheme of things. And so yeah, the best advice for an older runner is stay consistent by focusing on these big things that make the difference.
Yeah, the things that will give you the biggest return for your effort. That's to put most of
Exactly.
your focus.
Yeah.
Yeah. Brilliant, Rich. Thanks very much for your time. This has been unbelievable and very, very insightful. And is there any final points you want to wrap up on, or links or things you want to mention to the listeners?
I don't think so. No, we've covered some really good ground there, Ross. And again, I really appreciate the invitation to come on. And yeah, some really fantastic questions there, which hopefully beneficial for all of your listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. I really enjoyed it, and I know a lot of other people will. So thanks very much, Rich.
No problem. Thanks, Ross.